So my name is Janice Barbee, and I'm here with my colleague Craig Hassel. I'll let him introduce himself in a minute. But we are part of Healing Roots, which is an organization that was actually came out of the nonprofit, the Cultural Wellness Center in South Minneapolis, and we we're have been working I've been working there. I worked there for about 15 years, and it's one of the most diverse, I think it still is one of the most diverse neighborhoods in the state of Minnesota. And we worked with people from all over the world for all those years to work on improving health. And I learned an immense amount there. And the way actually when we before we even started the nonprofit, my colleague who's African American and I were doing a lot of groups, community groups, and we realized that there were the people, everyone could talk about their culture except for people of European heritage, racialized as white, where we actually had doctors who said, I don't have a culture, or I don't, I'm an American, so I'm not cultural. Um, and so that started me to start convening discussions. This was back in the 90s, about what is our culture, and sometimes we always met with just by cultural group, but also all together, everyone together with all different cultural groups, to talk about the importance of a healthy identity, and how do we move away from a racialized identity. And a lot of that was about how do we know our culture and claim our culture, and celebrate the beauty and the tensions in our culture. So it was so many different conversations, and it was out of those conversations that we formed Healing Roots, and learned so much that we put into our workshops now from those discussions. So I'm going to pass it to Craig to introduce himself.
Well, good afternoon, everyone. It's good to be with you all. My name is Craig Hassel, and I use he, him pronouns. I have a job at the University of Minnesota on St. Paul campus. I'm in the Department of Food Science and Nutrition, and was taught to be a scientist. And in fact, science, the way I was taught it in the natural sciences, biochemistry, physiology, bracketed out cultural context to a very significant degree, even to the point of our system of knowledge production. The disciplines, the professions were not taught as cultural constructions at all. And so I started studying with Janice about almost 20 years ago now, and began to understand myself as a cultural being in ways that the sciences never asked me to do at all. And what I find is that there's tremendous richness in cultural context that can allow us to help to transform the institution and ideology of whiteness that often infiltrates our scientific professions and disciplines. So I'm very happy to be here, and I look forward to working with you this afternoon.
So we'll start our slides, which we hope will help us to follow along here. So we like to start with just some understandings that we always want to name explicitly. That's helpful, we found. So one thing is the importance of knowing ourselves and how that's crucial to understanding others. That's one of the principles that we operate by, that we always emphasize knowing ourselves and learning more about our culture, and whoever we're talking to. It always helps that interaction. And then we also emphasize that everyone has a culture, but the more you're surrounded by people who are of a similar culture, the harder it is to see your culture. So we never want to make someone feel like there's something wrong, that they don't know their culture, that it's very natural that when you're surrounded by people of your own culture, it's harder to see it. You make it, it's the norm, it's what's the default. And so we all take many things about our culture for granted, especially if we're surrounded always, even in our work, by people who are very similar. We also hold hidden assumptions that profoundly influence our judgment and behaviors. And a lot of our work in Healing Roots is uncovering some of what's under the surface that's our judgments and behaviors are based on. So instead of just talking about those, we're trying to dig down. Why do we think that? Where did that come from? And then the invisibility of the European American culture, which is often primarily the mainstream culture. Certainly there's many influences from different cultures, and especially in different parts of the country. But we want people of European heritage to recognize that they have a culture, and it is very much, especially in institutions where people work, it is the culture that's the kind of the norm. And the resulting normalization of this culture contribute to the power of whiteness. So we want to point out that it's not just culture, it's not just attitudes about race, but it's also about the cultures that we assume are the norm. Our culture, our history, any pain and trauma that we may carry, all of these influence our ability to listen to another's pain and trauma, and to empathize and to support healing. So we know one of the theme of this conference is around truth telling. And what we found is it's so important that we recognize that a lot of what we carry in our culture influences the way we either do truth tellings, the way we're able to listen or not listen deeply, the way we're able to empathize or not empathize, make connections. All of those are influenced by some of our cultural assumptions, the things that we've inherited, and many of those are under the surface. We're not aware of them. They're invisible to us. So that's another reason why we think it's so important to kind of tease out some of these cultural characteristics that we'll be talking about today, so that we can understand how they're influencing the way we work with people of different cultures. So I'll pass it on to Craig.
Thank you, Janice. And we want to emphasize two practices, self-reflection. I'm a big believer in critical thinking, and a lot of times critical thinking is for understanding ideas out there in the books or in media or arguments of others. But I also think there's this very important and very powerful opportunity for us to examine our own thinking. And as Janice had mentioned, to try to understand some of the implicit dimension, some of these assumptions we make that might be subliminal or in our subconscious that we may not consciously be aware of. And so this requires this self-reflection, or what the Cultural Wellness Center refers to as cultural self-study. The other practice that I want to mention, and that is very much a pillar of the Healing Roots work, is both and thinking. And I want to contrast it with either or thinking that goes back, for example, to the ancient Greek understanding of non-contradiction. A thing can't be itself and something else at the same time. And so that reflects this either or approach to life, this either or mentality that is very much still a part of our modern science and how knowledge progresses. We talk about formulating hypotheses in terms of questions that can be addressable as either true or false. And that binary keeps us from examining a broader spectrum of both and ideas. And so it's very easy for us to get stuck by either or thinking. And so that's a very important practice. Next slide.
Whoops.
So we want to ask you to reflect on your identity. This is very important. I think it's a lifelong practice. How do we see ourselves, and how are we taught to see ourselves? So often we're taught to fit into racialized categories that can't hold the complexity of who we are as human beings and how we identify. We ask how others see us. Oftentimes there's differences between how we see ourselves and how others might see us. So we need to reflect on that as well. To whom and to what are we connected? Connections to land, connections to people. Do we have a sense of peoplehood that we carry with us culturally? Where do we have a sense of belonging? How do we feel that? How do we feel when we're outside of that sense of belonging? And how might that influence our sense of health and well-being? And then who can we count on? Who can we rely upon to be supportive in our own growth and development? Sometimes these questions can be very difficult. They can be touchy and very nuanced in how we navigate them. And they can raise some defenses among people, particularly those who have this highly racialized sense of their identity. And so we want to, again, show some compassion and humility in terms of how we work with others on these questions. And I will turn it back over to Janice.
Thank you. So we find these kind of thinking of our identity in terms of many layers is really helpful when we're asking ourselves these kinds of questions. So one of the things we look at is, and we do exercises in our workshops around, is having people describe their identity in terms of drawings. And so there's there's our individual identity, and then within our family, within our community or the region we're in, we might identify with being Midwest or Minnesotan, or rural or urban, or many different ways geographically we can identify ourselves. And certainly with our ethnicity, with our ancestry, all the things that part of our heritage that are part of our identity, and then our mainstream culture that we're in. And for many people, excuse me, many people, we might make some of these circles intersecting instead of concentric. So if our ethnicity is very different from the mainstream culture, we might move that circle out so it's just intersecting with mainstream culture. Excuse me just a sec. And then we always acknowledge that there's this deep culture that we're a part of that's way, way below the surface. That's about the ways of thinking, the ways of knowing. It comes from our language, whether our language, our first language, has a lot of words that maybe English doesn't have. And so we actually think differently. So there's a lot in deep culture that we explore in Healing Roots, because those aspects of those cultures have such deep influence on everything that we think about and do. And because it's so normally just so hidden from us, it's difficult for us to recognize how much influence that does have. And then we put race across, because race really isn't a part of culture. It comes out of culture. It's a constructed identity that comes out of culture, but it doesn't have the depth of culture. It doesn't have creation stories. It doesn't have all this, the mythology and the the symbols and the all the rich history that that what we're talking about as culture has. So it's something that's been constructed. It's an ideology that came out of European culture, but it's not a culture in itself. And then we also want to acknowledge on this by this graphic on the right that our identities are very complex and they're composed of so many different things, much more than even what's named there. And that when we the problem with race is it's taken over such a huge part of when we talk about identity, and it ignores all of this rich complexity of who we are. And so we also want, as people think about their identity, to think about all the richness of our identity that connects us to place, to history, to our ancestry, to our belief systems, to everything that's important to us, certainly our relationships and our roles in society, the things we care about. So we just want it's one of the things we talk about in Healing Roots is we don't want to just talk about what's wrong with the world, what's wrong with our society. We really want to spend a lot of time thinking about what is a healthy identity, what's a healthy culture look like, what's our vision for the future. And we think this kind of foundational understandings is really important to build that vision. Excuse me. So we think it's important to name just what we mean as culture. So it's basically what is created and shared by a group and transmitted through language, behaviors. There's lots of objects that are a part of culture, ritual, institutions, the arts, the way we communicate, and it moves from one generation to the next. It's always changing. But the most prominent, the things on the surface are changing, like the slang, dress, all the fashions kinds of things. But the deeper you go into culture, the slower it takes to change anything. It's the sum of the attitudes and the customs. So it includes things like, of course, our language, connection to land and customs and protocols. As we talked about, the roles and the values. Rituals are certainly a part of culture, which contain a lot of the meaning of that culture. And our relationships are central to culture. The way we relate to each other, the way we understand our heritage, and the roles that we take because of those relationships. So I'll pass it back to Craig.
Thank you, Janice. As Janice was saying, culture can be hard to see. Learning to see some of these deeper, more implicit dimensions of culture within ourselves can be a lifelong developmental task. In my own case, I saw no need to give my own culture any serious consideration for the first 35 years of my life. In fact, becoming a professional nutrition scientist, earning my advanced degrees, becoming tenured at the University of Minnesota did not help me to see culture in myself, in my profession, or in the science that I was practicing. In fact, as I mentioned earlier, the sciences tended to bracket out culture as subjective in, again, our commitments to objective knowledge. So these deeper, more implicit and subjective dimensions of culture can be difficult for us to see. Next slide, Janice. So we want to acknowledge that everything on a culture is on a continuum. And a lot of what we talk about in terms of characteristics are generalizations, but there's always great variability among individuals within a culture. And of course, there are generational differences across a culture. The culture evolves over time, but still these qualities and characteristics will give us continuity and cohesion over generations. There are always both healthful and unhealthful characteristics in our culture. And of course, we talk a lot about dismantling whiteness and undoing whiteness. And in Healing Roots, we like to talk about whiteness as an ideology or as an institution that has permeated our mainstream cultural context. And of course, we want to acknowledge the mixed messages, even contradictory messages that we often get, especially if we're a part of our mainstream institutions. A couple of examples here: follow your head and follow your heart can be two things. Ask for help or do it yourself. And I found many mixed message in terms of values that we espouse and make public, and then the actual values that drive behavior and motivation for how people act. There can be significant dissonance in our cultures. So again, we want to recognize the value of generalizations in culture, but we also want to recognize the complexities and that everything on a culture is in a continuum. And so then we want to stop for a moment, next slide, and see if there are questions or comments based on what you've heard. We want to give you a chance to engage in a little conversation with us at this point. So I'll open the floor for anyone who would like to share. Any insights or any reflections that anyone has? Yeah, Thomas.
Nothing reflective upon myself, but I really appreciate the way of looking at culture as having depth. And the deeper you go into anybody's cultural history, the harder it becomes to kind of see it, but also to enact change in that way. I think that's something that to me seems pretty universal across human cultures. And I really appreciate that outlook.
Yeah, thank you, Thomas. What we find is that there are dimensions of culture that can be more evolutionary and change more rapidly. These tend to be more visible, tangible expressions of culture, but there are also those dimensions of culture that really change very, very slowly over time. What is important to know? What knowledge is important? Certain characteristics of value outlooks are very, very resistant to change over time. And so these deeper dimensions, not only are they less changing over time, but they have governing power over some of the more superficial dimensions of culture that are often more visible to us. Any other thoughts or comments? Well, if not, we want to just say that we really value and appreciate the interaction, and Healing Roots was really built on this idea of community knowledge production. And we feel very strongly that these kinds of conversations are sources of knowledge production and very much a central part of what we are actually presenting to you. It's based on hundreds and hundreds of conversations in community situations just like this. And so I will turn it over to Janice to keep us moving.
Thank you, Craig. From those probably thousands by now, since we started in 96, I think, conversations, we developed this model that we think is important to study. And we found it's helpful. We've done many workshops with just with people of European heritage, racialized as white, and with people from all other different cultures. Worked in Latino institutions and African American and Asians, Native Americans. So we found this. People have told us this is helpful. Was somebody talking? Okay. We found this is very helpful for people of many cultures to as a model for what we need to better understand in order to do this work together of dismantling whiteness. So we have these 3 dimensions that we discuss and learn about together. So the first is, what is our modern mainstream culture? What are its characteristics? What are its values? We look at what makes it both something that we are proud of, that we there's so many positive things in it that we appreciate, and where are things out of balance or have become too extreme or don't serve us well. Maybe they served us at one point and they don't serve us anymore. And where do they rub against the values and characteristics of other cultures? So we become aware of what is causing tension. We think that's really so important as we work with each other across culture. And then we also, of course, study whiteness, the history of whiteness. We use the kind of, this graphic is of a forest in the South where there's kudzu. I don't know if people, it doesn't grow here, so, but it's this invasive vine that covers up trees and kills all the branches and leaves and eventually can just kill off a forest. And we kind of think of whiteness that way, that it's this invasive vine that grew out of our culture that destroys the identity underneath it, destroys those connections to all these things. So people gave up a lot of those connections when they became white. They no longer, it's kind of strange that, and it's been pointed out many times to me that we often talk about like African American and Asian American and even Native American, but then there's just the category white. And we're not naming European American. So we study also narratives of whiteness, which is what we're going to be talking about tomorrow, that are more cultural. I don't know if anybody else can hear that, but I keep getting somebody else's discussion, I think.
Seeking compensation for
so it's a little distracting. Sorry about that. So then we also think it's important to study our root cultures, which are those cultures that are of our ancestors, where we came from, that connect us to culture, that connect us to a place, an environment, connect us to nature, connect us to deep stories, deep stories about why we're alive, why we're in the world, that are so crucial to our understandings of how to live a good life and how to live in harmony with our environment and with each other. So we want to in many ways reclaim those that were lost because of the transition to being white. Or to inherit, if we're not white, to inheriting this hierarchical system of identity rather than a cultural identity. So today we're just going to be talking about this modern mainstream culture and its characteristics. So these are some of the characteristics that we've collected over time. That many of these are from the Peace Corps when they train people to go to another country and do work in another country. They've named some of these to help people understand their own culture in America. But we've also added a few as we've had discussions in the community. So we're going to be kind of calling out and describing the ones that are in blue. And then we'll be having a discussion, a small group discussion. So people can talk about which ones they think are important to them. And as you think about your own life, but also working with people of different cultures, which ones are very much affect those interactions and our abilities to really connect with each other. So I'll pass it back to Craig to start us off.
Okay, thank you, Janice. And I'll begin with individualism. Our mainstream culture is highly individualistic. The idea that our own fulfillment, our own performance is measured as individuals from the time we were very young, growing up in school, where we were given grades as individuals. Oftentimes we have performance review, which is our individual performance. Independence, self-reliance are very highly valued. Individual effort is encouraged and rewarded. We're taught to stand on our own 2 feet. We're often valued as individuals, and even more, we're taught to see ourselves as separate from others. And oftentimes our fate is seen as separate from others. We're often taught to think of ourselves as being able to be responsible for a fate that's separate from others. And we also tend to, as a culture, to dissuade this idea of vulnerability to the point where asking for help can feel as though one is being weak. I know I've felt that as a male, that I should be able to solve my own problems. I shouldn't have to ask for directions. I shouldn't have to ask for assistance. And again, recognition often comes to individuals, especially high-performing individuals who may take a little time here or there to recognize some of their team that's behind them. But again, the fundamental reward focuses on the individual. Our identity is as an individual. We don't see ourselves as a function of a group. We don't see our group as superseding ourselves as individuals in most cases. And another final dimension of this is our HIPAA regulations, that individual privacy is important to the point of protecting our personal health information from even our closest relatives. So that gives you an idea of how strongly individualized our mainstream culture is. Next slide.
Craig, I just want to emphasize, if we just want to make the point that if your culture is not of this culture, this mainstream culture, this naming these things can help. And what we found is it can help people to understand where there are tensions, and also to recognize that most institutions operate by these characteristics. And so even if your own culture is not of this culture, you're often basically forced to work in an environment which has this culture, and that can create a lot of tension. And we found people have named, it's so helpful to name it out loud what some of those tensions are. So we hope this is helpful for you.
Yeah, thank you, Janice. And I just want to add a little bit to that, and that's a lot of times adaptation to these characteristics can be a process of assimilation, some of which may be welcome, but some of which may be feel unwelcome assimilation. And I think it's very important for our institution for us to recognize these as larger systemic issues so that people don't put all of the burden on themselves, particularly when it comes to this idea of unwelcome assimilation. Another strong characteristic in our mainstream culture is progress. This idea of progress really tends to usurp the vast majority of human history as a species, in that our new knowledge is usually preferred over older knowledge. Change is seen as for the better. And while there are many cases that's true, oftentimes we lack attention toward what is lost as the new replaces the old. And if we, oftentimes to the point where tradition can be seen as getting in the way of progress. And oftentimes we see technology as the answer. Technology is put out as a promise for a better life and making things easier, making things less stressful for us. Of course, there's some very mixed feelings about that within our mainstream culture as well, but the tendency is there. Every problem should have a solution. We should be able to solve things. If something's wrong, we should be able to do something about it. We may not believe perfection is always obtainable, but that we should move in that direction, and we should strive, we should aspire to it by this idea of progress, by making a better world. And another point I want to make is that there's much good in this characteristic, but it's also something that can become unhealthful if it's seen as universally applicable in all cases. And so we want to recognize these tendencies within our culture, and we want to begin to think about what is working for us in this characteristic, and where is our attachment to this characteristic, where is that becoming less healthful or less healthy. Again, as Janice mentioned, respecting that sometimes this is required in a process of assimilation in order to survive in the mainstream cultural context. And I will turn it over to Janice.
So productivity is another one that we find people really grab a hold of and like to discuss a lot. This idea that we always should be productive. We should always be busy. We should always be doing something. And we feel a little guilty if we're just sitting around doing nothing. So doing is more valued than being. There's an old story that I learned from someone who is East Indian, who is saying that in his culture, there's a story of Alexander the Great meeting a sage who's meditating. And Alexander the Great asks the sage, "What are you doing?" And he says, "I'm doing nothing." And the sage asks Alexander the Great, "What are you doing?" And he says, "I'm conquering the world." And they each look at each other like, "You are such a fool." What are you doing? Because there's such different values. And that's another thing that I just want to bring up, that we find that the more we can learn from each other across culture, the more we see some of these things more in high relief, where we realize, oh, there's a different way of looking at the world, or there's a different way of being. This isn't just what everyone around the world is thinking or doing. So a common question when you meet someone in America is, what do you do? Because of this emphasis on the importance of productivity. Whereas I've learned from meeting many people from other cultures, the first question you'll ask is, who are your people, or where do you come from? Who's your family? So you're finding a way to connect, find some connection, some area of commonality, or even if it's very weak or circuitous. Getting things done is valued over talk. So this was where I've seen a lot of difference. I worked with hospitals where nurses from, for instance, Africa, their culture is you have to get a connection with people before you talk about their health. So you talk about their family, you talk about, how many children do you have? you know, how just more connection kinds of questions. And you would never, it's disrespectful to immediately get to the task. Whereas because we're such a productive culture, we often want to immediately get to what are we doing versus, you know, establishing relationships. Another one is self-worth is based in work and material possessions. And of course, I mean, this isn't, again, we're not saying everyone holds to these in equal measure, but this is a prominent, it's more of a generalization that we often, our self-esteem is very much centered in what we've done with our lives, what we've achieved. And we often look at people in terms of their job, that tells us a lot about someone, what their career is, or what car they drive, or what house they live in, you know, those kinds of things, how they dress. So we do, and our media has a big role to play in this. We do tend to really look at those things to judge people, or to draw conclusions about people. And they're also, you might also say, because of our culture and because of the immensity of the geography of the United States, we've also inherited sort of this idea that big is better. So big meals, you know, big cars, just more is better. That's, I think you can, and that's a great question to ask, is where did this come from? And when you're looking at characteristics, how did this develop the way it did? And that's one thing that's been shown, is that even our geography can have a big influence on the characteristics of our culture and the way we, you know, the things that we value. Pass it back to you, Craig.
Thank you, Janice. I just want to remind us all that these characteristics are always on a continuum. And as we go through these, you may be feeling a sense of, well, I push back on this tendency, I push back on that. And that's precisely the kind of thinking and reflection we really value in Healing Roots. And so certainly all individuals don't hold tightly to all of these generalized characteristics. But a lot of times, a lot of our energy is spent pushing back on these cultural tendencies. So we just want to encourage you to stay with that if you're feeling that. Another one, of course, is the natural world is controllable, that humankind is seen as the pinnacle of creation, at least in Judeo-Christian teachings and accounts. And therefore, humans sometimes seem to have a obligation to control nature. There are teachings that nature is imperfect as is, and that humankind can improve upon what is naturally created in the natural world. So that the natural world is something to understand, to manipulate, and even subjugate for the benefit of humans. And this idea of benefiting of humans, we get into our economic system of capitalism and this idea of profit. And that brings us back to the more is better that Janice was mentioning, how a lot of times subjugating nature for more profit really creates an imbalance that is not only unhealthy for the environment, but it's unhealthy for us as human beings. So the world isn't perfect, and it needs improvement from the human hand, and that's why we were given intelligence the way we are. That's there's a lot of narrative around that. And the idea that how nature works or how it understands can be elucidated and known. And of course, the pharmaceutical industry is an excellent example of fixing symptoms, and a lot of times finding mechanisms of action that can make our drugs more effective. And certainly drugs are a way of controlling nature. And of course, there are many, many benefits to this, i.e. the most recent development of COVID vaccines have proven wonderful addition to our public health repertoire. But a lot of times an over-attachment to this characteristic can lead to things like climate change and devastation of our planet. And in contrast, we look at other cultures and see the word harmony with nature, being in harmony with nature rather than this idea of subjugating nature. Next slide. Another characteristic that we see is that suffering is something we should be able to do something about. We should be happy because we are in control of our own lives. And we often talk about this as an internal locus of control, that if we're unhappy, we should be able to do something about it. We should be able to do self-improvement. We should be able to fix things. The idea that it's not appropriate to express strong emotions. And again, I'm of Germanic and Swiss German heritage, and I was taught Stoicism is really important. Suck it up. A little bit of pain doesn't hurt things. It makes you stronger. Keep this to yourself. Let's not, let's spare others from our own complaints. And so I'm not saying that's necessarily wrong, but again, over-attachment to that can lead us into some unhealthy patterns. So I will turn it back over to Janice.
I just will tell a quick story of being in a room with two African-American women who were arguing with each other and just really going at it and being very emotional. And then one of them said, I'm getting hungry. Let's go out to lunch. And I thought, if that was my family, they wouldn't speak to each other for days. But this is amazing that they can be so expressive. It really showed me my own culture. It was a big contrast. So I wanted to mention a little bit about how we view time in America. So especially because of industrialization, we see time as something external. It's in we think of a clock and the minutes and seconds and hours of a clock. And it's almost like a commodity. We talk about it that way. We spend it, we save it, we waste it, just like it was currency. And deadlines and schedules are very important. We have to stick to a schedule. And we don't easily change plans or even agendas. People may be too busy to see you, and it's rude to keep people waiting. And what's past is past. So this also affects the way we see history. So we see history as, and especially because if we see ourselves as an individual, then our sense of self is not so influenced by others, and especially by history. We don't see history influencing us. So for instance, I've been in truth tellings where I've heard people who are racialized as white say, "Why are you bringing this up now? That happened a long time ago." Because there's that sense that, well, I'm not influenced by history. I don't even know my history. I don't know my family's history. And so what's past is past. Whereas people of many other cultures in the world, history is living inside of us. History is part of the present, actually. And you're always looking at history and being influenced by it and by your ancestors. And that's, again, it's important. Especially, I think in this topic, I've seen a lot of discussion really go deep, because people of different cultures have such different understandings of time, where if you come from a culture where it's your sense of time is always fluid, and you can always be interrupted. You can always, it's that people are more important than schedules, where if you set a time for a wedding, for instance, at 4 o'clock, you might not start until 6 o'clock until everybody gets there. You know, it's such a different way of looking at time. And this is, I've seen as a really, a very rich discussion for how our institutions operate when we have people of different cultures, you know, with very different understandings of time. And also, I think this is a very important topic for truth telling, that for us to really understand, what does history mean to us? What does the past mean to us? And how do we carry the past inside of us? It's a very rich discussion. And finally, we just want to point out this idea of objective knowledge valued over subjective experience, where in most institutions in the United States, we have this idea of how certain kinds of knowledge have the most authority. So there's like this hierarchy of knowledges, in a sense. So I'm sure you've seen heard about the gold standard of double-blind studies, that where you can, this idea of objectivity, where you can remove yourself from something so that it has more truth. And this idea that the most profound knowledge is that which is universal and replicable, the most reliable knowledge. Also, knowledge that is abstract is considered having a more authority than knowledge that's more personal. And certainly knowledge that you can write down has a lot of authority over knowledge that you can't write down. That's so I always think of the things that are skills from doing something over and over and over again, that you can't put in a manual. You have to be apprenticed in order to learn it, and how those knowledges are often not given the full credit that they're due, because they can't be written down. And again, this is something that sometimes you can understand better if you contrast it with knowledges of other cultures, where, for instance, there's knowledge isn't a noun, but it's a verb. It's only a verb, because you always have to understand knowledge in terms of the relationship between the knower and the known, and that it's always affected. The knower always affects what is known. And that's the understanding in many cultures, versus there's something that's fixed out there that we can know, and it's not affected by the knower. And that has profound implications for the way we understand the world and the way we look at other cultures. So I just want to come back to this list and have you look at it again. I'll just mention some of the other ones. This idea of risk taking. Americans are often seen as some of the most willing to take risks compared to people of other cultures. There's also this idea of the separation of the material and the spiritual. So, for instance, in our sciences, we don't, in medicine, we don't study how spiritual, or look at how there could be spiritual causes for disease, whereas in other cultures, that would be the first thing you would think about. Egalitarianism as an espoused value. It's certainly, as I'm sure you've talked about already, it's not something that is always shows up in our society, but it is something that is publicly acknowledged, that it is a goal for our society. The idea of free will is very important in our society. Informality, having come from societies that had very formal titles and a very structured class system, the Americans tend to be much more informal. and not use titles, for instance. Or if somebody comes over to your house, you just say, help yourself, or, you don't stand on some kind of protocol. Certainly youthfulness and fitness is a value, to be young, to stay young, to cover up those wrinkles and try and be as fit as possible. And so it affects the way we look at our elders. So the role of elders is very different in different cultures. And then the boundary between personal and professional is also one that we've seen very much affect institutions and people, especially immigrants who come to this country with different ideas of what it means to be a professional, and not have the same kind of boundaries that this idea of objectivity, being objective, causes professionals to have to abide by. So those are some of the other ones. So we want you to look at this list and think of maybe 2 or 3 that you would be interested in talking about. And then I'll turn it over to Craig to get us into some groups. So I'll just leave it up there for a few seconds here so you can choose something you're interested in.
So again, with Healing Roots, we really value small group conversations. And again, we find that a lot of the knowledge comes from conversation, people sharing knowledge and insights, and then those emerging. So what we like to do is, through the Zoom technology, we like to break out into small groups for conversation, and then we'll do that for about 15 minutes and then reconvene on the other side. And we would very much like you to be able to share some of the insights, observations, some of the knowledge that's surfaced, or some of the highlights of your conversation for the benefit of everyone. And so I guess we'll ask Janice to divide us into small groups.
So many good conversations in those side rooms.
Yes, wonderful. We had some wonderful conversation in our small group, and what we like to do now is to just open the floor to anyone who would like to share based on what came up in their small groups.
I guess if I can, just to maybe kick things off, or maybe it will not kick things off anywhere. Maybe it's just on my mind. As someone who had a lot of difficulty confronting like my own attachments that formed when I was very, very young to the mainstream culture that we've sort of described, like the white culture, the American quote unquote culture. My initial knee-jerk reaction to realizing that those things weren't serving me well and that they were actually more facade than they were substance was resentment, like deep resentment towards my upbringing, my childhood, the way I was taught history, all of those things, rather than seeing them as not like personal affronts to myself, but things that were systemic, bigger, the kudzu, like you described. As a queer person who didn't come out until he was in his mid-20s, there's a lot of resentment towards the environments that fostered those facades, the mainstream cultural things that were not serving me, that were not my actual culture. And that's one of the reasons I'm here where I am now. That's one of the reasons I'm in the upper Midwest and I haven't left. I haven't moved to a metro area. I'm a country mouse, like at heart, but also like I want to see change in those places so people can feel more compelled to connect with what their actual culture is and who they actually are, so they don't have to go through the years of resentment and the pain and the searching for their actual culture while also trying to cast off the sort of the facades and masks they've been taught.
Thank you, Thomas. Very, very powerful. You've done a lot of work, and we really appreciate hearing your experience and the wisdom that brings in navigating this and trying to tease through these relationships between our mainstream culture and what we refer to in Healing Roots as this ideology or institution of whiteness. Any other comments, thoughts, reflections? We're very patient in Healing Roots.
I mean, I can talk about something that was interesting in our group. In the second group I was put in was a little bit of the concept of environment influencing culture, as in the weather, the climate. If you're always in a place that kind of stays the same, if it's always kind of warm, how that influences your culture, as opposed to where I am now, where you have season changes. So there's always these markers kind of that you have to get ready for. There's always like something coming up that I think pushes more of that immediacy and that idea of progress, linear progress in time, because something's going to change and you're going to have to adapt to that change because of the weather and things like that. And that's an interesting concept too, of how, where you actually physically live is probably has to do with your culture and how you look at how time happens.
Yeah, thank you, Crystal. And in fact, my Germanic ancestors, we believe that Stoicism really came from having to survive the winters in very close quarters, and that this was a way to try to do that. And as I started working with indigenous communities, the winters were their storytelling seasons where they passed down knowledge in their oral traditions. And so different cultures found different ways of adapting to climate change and to the seasons, the rhythm of the seasons. And what's interesting is, as we look back in our ancestors, we see patterns, the idea that relationships between us and nature were much more predictive of weather, of patterns of seasonal change, rather than relying on calendars. And of course, the clock is a relatively recent invention. And this idea of dividing time into snippets, and then with the advent of market economy, time is money. These are relatively newer ideas, but of course, we've sort of become quite attached to those markers of progress, markers of time, markers of materialism as we move forward. So thank you for that. You're right. Natural rhythms are a very important part of culture. Other thoughts or comments, insights?
This is Maria. I just how myself, how I live in two different cultures, and I made my own. Because I'm here in America, but then I'm from Mexico. My family is biracial, and I try to teach the good from the both worlds to my kids. And while they're older now, they have their own life. But I think they can see that, and they can see and be open to the world, because they enjoy to be with other people, with no matter who they are or where they come from. They're always have open mind, and that's what I was looking when now they have my young older kids. They went to college and they enjoy their time in there, meeting people from all over the world. So, and I'm just grateful that I can teach my kids the best from Mexico and my husband the best from America, and try to move along even with this climate that we live on right now.
Thank you, Maria. I appreciate that. It's a wonderful teaching of navigating two cultures and allowing ourselves to not have to choose, not have to be either or, but to be able to bring the best of what each culture carries with it. And we like to reinforce the idea that each culture has strengths. And your comments bring forward that healthy intercultural sharing, even in a multicultural context, that really is a very, very powerful step to move forward for a better tomorrow for future generations. So thank you for that. Any last comments? We have maybe time for one more reflection before we turn it over to Janice.
Before either one of you leave, will you both make sure to put your contact information into the chat in case maybe someone doesn't feel comfortable in talking in this kind of setting or in this kind of space, but would like to directly reach out to you?
Sure, be happy to do that.
Thank you.
So any last comments? Questions? Observations? Well, we want to thank you all for being here. I'll turn it over to Janice to close us out. You're on mute, Janice.
I always do that. Thanks so much for participating today. And we hope this is helpful to kind of dig below the surface at what might be some tensions, both in your own understanding of your own culture and in your work with people of different cultures. We found these examining these and kind of digging into them to be really helpful as kind of a foundation for understanding what we have to do to dismantle whiteness, because it's not just like I say, it's not just attacking the problem and identifying what's wrong, but it's also building a foundation of what is a healthy culture for us. There's a researcher that we really like from Australia. We discovered his name is Richard Eckersley, and he's written a lot of articles about what's a healthy culture. And he believes, he's worked a lot with drug dependency and drug addiction. And he says that he believes from his research that a lot of why young people have such a hard time is because we don't have a healthy culture. So it's not policy, it's not just policy or, the availability of drugs or the strength of families. It's because we're not providing all the things that children and youth need to be healthy. And he says we're actually committing cultural fraud is the term he uses. If you want to Google cultural fraud, Richard Eckersley, Eckersley. It's a really interesting idea. And we also see these as foundational to understanding, as we were talking about before, understanding how to hold the painful histories of the United States and do it in a way that is healing instead of a way that re-traumatizes or makes people turn into victims rather than be resilient people. So there's lots of this foundational work that we do in order to have the capacity and the resources to then address the things that we need to change. So we hope that this has been helpful. And I'll just share the last slide is our website. So let me get that up here. It's healingrootscommunity.com. And we do monthly discussions. We have a learning community. It's free of charge. We just invite people to come and discuss something for an hour and a half. And at the end of every meeting, we decide what to discuss the next meeting. And it's always to do with either the mainstream culture or whiteness or our root culture. And so if you go there, you'll find what our next, at the end of this month, what our next discussion is, and you're welcome to join us. So we also have a workshop that we do occasionally. So, and there's other resources there, including, you'll see under resources, the list of characteristics that we talked about today is also on that website. So thank you so much. We're so happy to have joined you. And we hope that maybe we'll meet you someday and hear more about all the work you're doing. So thank you.